Head on over to the Call Me Ezekiel merch store to pick up your very own Welcome to Finland 1940 hoodie. It's 10% off until April 27th. Link is in the description. Carl Gustav Emil Mannerheim was born the son of Finnish aristocracy on June 4, 1867. Like most of Finland's nobility, Mannerheim was not ethnically Finnish, but a Swede. He spoke Swedish as his first language. And, in spite of being destined to become the father and multi-time savior of the nation, never learned to speak Finnish well. Mannerheim joined the Finnish Corps of Cadets when he turned 14, but fled across the Russian border after getting caught AWOL. There, he enrolled in the Tsar's Nikolaevsky Cavalry School, where he'd graduate with a commission in 1889. 2 years later, he joined the prestigious Chevalier Guards stationed in the Winter Palace, a posting that put him in almost daily contact with the royal family. At the coronation of the last Tsar, Nicholas II, Mannerheim was stationed in a position of honor at the foot of the stairs leading up to the throne. He would stand there at attention for 4.5 hours. Mannerheim would always remember the ceremony as indescribably magnificent. He was not just some toy soldier, though. Mannerheim served with distinction during the Russo-Japanese War and, 2 years later, led an expedition through Central Asia, from Turkestan to Peking. He would even take a detour to the holy city of Lhasa in Tibet, where he struck up a personal relationship with the Dalai Lama and taught the Bodhisattva how to shoot a handgun. Mannerheim would serve under General Brusilov in the First World War and would emerge from the conflict as a corps commander himself. When the Russian Revolution spread to the army in 1917, Mannerheim was saved from capture and likely execution by the Reds, thanks to being stationed in Odessa where he was recovering from a wound. So with Russia falling apart around him, Mannerheim returned to Finland, arriving on December 5th, one day after its parliament voted to declare independence. For the first time in 35 years, Mannerheim was home, and it was in a state of civil war. So you can call me Ezekiel. And this is Finland's Civil War, Winter War, and the Continuation War. But first, I want to thank this video's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. In Tacticus, you'll collect champions from across the warring factions of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, and lead them to victory in tactical turn-based skirmishes. Tacticus features champions from Chaos, Xenos, and multiple Space Marine chapters, and each champion has unique special abilities that augments how you use them on the battlefield. Once you've assembled your team, you'll lead it in a variety of game modes, including the PvE campaign, player versus player, live events, guild raids, and so much more, because new content is getting added to Tacticus all the time. Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus is officially licensed by Games Workshop and has a 4.5-star rating on the App Store. If you're still not sure, Tacticus is free to play, so you have nothing to lose by trying it out. Scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description, and use our promo code HELLOAPR to get 2,000 gold and 50 Blackstone. But this offer is only available for a limited time, so take advantage before it's gone. Finland first entered the European system after its conquest by Sweden in the Middle Ages. As medieval Sweden grew into the modern empire, Finland provided some of its best auxiliary troops. This lasted until Sweden's defeat by Russia in the Finnish War of 1808, which saw Finland transferred to Russia as an autonomous duchy. Russian Finland was largely left to its own devices until the 19th century, allowing it to experience rapid industrialization and population growth. But by the turn of that century, the Russians began to chip away at their autonomy. In spite of the tensions that this created, the Revolution of 1905 was not nearly as violent in Finland as it was in the rest of the empire, and order was quickly restored in Finland. The Russian Revolution of 1917 was a different story, though. While Finland was a part of the Russian Empire during the First World War, many Finns volunteered to fight for the Central Powers. Several thousand Finns would join Germany's elite 27th Prussian Jaeger Battalion, which fought on both eastern and western fronts of the war. Veterans of the 27th would play an essential role in all of Finland's coming conflicts. According to historian William R. Trotter, almost every successful Finnish field commander in both the Civil War and Winter War received his basic training in the 27th Jaegers. Veterans of that unit became, for all practical purposes, an elite professional caste. Finland's national-level response to the Russian Revolution was to elect a Soviet parliament that then voted to assert the nation's autonomy. This outraged the conservatives, who resigned in protest. But when the socialists lost their majority in the October Revolution, they radicalized too, and decided to follow in the Bolsheviks' footsteps by initiating a revolution to retake control of Finland by force. Amidst the ensuing radicalization and growth of red and white militias, Finland declared its independence from Russia on December 4th. By January 29, 1918, the crisis came to a head. Members of the now revolutionary Social Democratic Party formed a new government, the Finnish Socialist Workers' Republic, also known as Red Finland, and took control of the major cities and nearly all of southern Finland, including the capital at Helsinki. But both the countryside and several key cities remained in white hands. A split like that could only mean one thing: civil war. The Reds began the Civil War with a marked advantage over the Whites. In addition to controlling the most valuable parts of Finland, the Red Guard were both numerically and materially superior to the Whites, outnumbering them 40,000 to 25,000. The Reds also enjoyed the tacit support of the 70,000 Russian troops still stationed in the country. However, a combination of Mannerheim's leadership and the return of the veterans of the 27th Jaegers were more than able to make up for this. Mannerheim was appointed commander-in-chief of the White forces shortly after his arrival. One of his first moves was to march his army to Vasa, where 40,000 Russians were garrisoned. There, the Whites played a trick by placing their best-equipped soldiers at the front of the column. This made it look to the Russian garrison like the whole White army was well-equipped and dangerous, so to avoid a deadly confrontation over a conflict they didn't really care that much about, the garrison surrendered. This one move removed 40,000 potential Reds from Finland and secured the weapons and supplies the White Army needed to prosecute the war. On January 31st, the Reds began their first and only major offensive of the war targeting Vilppula. But it failed to make any meaningful progress. This allowed the Whites to seize the initiative with their own offensive towards Tampere, the third most populous city in Finland. This offensive was way more successful, surrounding the city and 15,000 Red Guards inside. Initial attempts to storm the city were unsuccessful though, but after being reinforced by men from the 27th Jaegers, it was taken on April 6th. However, Finland's fate would not be decided by the Red or White armies. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which established peace between Germany and the Soviet Union, put Finland firmly within the German sphere of influence. The Germans intended to collect on that. On February 14th, the Finnish Whites were pressured into asking the German government for its assistance in the Civil War. Tens of thousands of German troops were promptly landed on the south coast and captured Helsinki from the Reds in just a couple of days. The Germans then joined the White Army in chasing down the last significant Red resistance to Viborg, whose fall convinced the remaining communist forces to surrender in early May. The last Red-held position at Fort Eno would be captured on May 15, 1918. The following day, Mannerheim led his troops in a triumphant parade through the capital. Like most other revolutionary conflicts, both the Red and White forces committed atrocities known as Red and White terrors against enemy combatants, prisoners, and civilians. As the war's victor, the Whites were able to inflict their terror on more people and for longer. Executions were the norm, and were usually only stopped due to a lack of ammunition. At least 10,000 prisoners would survive and be kept in camps where they suffered from appalling conditions, and high mortality rates as a result. By the war's end, the Red Terror would claim roughly 2,000 lives, while the Whites killed at least 10,000. The total death toll for the Civil War was roughly 35,000 people, which was over 1% of Finland's population. The victorious Germans declared Finland a protectorate and appointed a new pro-German government there. Mannerheim was not to last in the new administration. He wanted to pursue the Reds into Russia, take East Karelia for Finland, and possibly even Petrograd. But the Germans negotiated a very favorable treaty with the Soviets, so didn't want to let their Finnish subjects sabotage it. Mannerheim resigned in protest. On October of 1918, the Finnish parliament was pressured into placing Kaiser Wilhelm's brother-in-law, Frederick Charles of Hesse, on the Finnish throne. But this king-in-waiting wouldn't even set foot in Finland. The World War had turned against the Central Powers, resulting in Germany's political collapse. The Kaiser was forced to abdicate, and Germany was declared a republic. Mannerheim quickly met with the war's victors, Britain and France, to salvage Finland's position. They agreed to protect Finland if it broke itself off from Germany. Thus, German troops were forced to leave the country, and Mannerheim became the nation's regent until a new government could be created. After the Germans left, the Finnish people voted for their new form of government. Options included a monarchy or a constitution with either a strong or weak presidency. The Social Democrats, the party most associated with the failed Red government, were allowed to participate in these elections and advocated for the last option. Remarkably, those Social Democrats and their allies won the vote by a huge margin. So in spite of having just fought a civil war to keep the Social Democrats out of power, the Finnish people voted them right back into it. Much of this can be attributed to the Social Democrats making clear during their campaign that they no longer supported revolution. Even more remarkably, Mannerheim then failed to win the first presidential election, even though most people considered him to be a shoo-in candidate. And so, in the ruins of its civil war, the modern state of Finland was born. Relations between Finland and the Soviet Union almost started out warmly. The two countries signed the Treaty of Tartu in 1920, establishing their mutual borders. But conflict arose shortly after when separatists rose up in Russian East Karelia. Up to 2,000 Finns crossed the border to fight for the rebels, something which the Soviets were not happy about. In Karelia, the Finnish Civil War played out again in miniature, as many of the Soviet troops were Red Finns who fled across the border. The Karelian uprising would end in failure by March of 1922, prompting up to 30,000 East Karelians to flee to Finland. Things would only get worse from there. On August 23, 1939, German and Soviet diplomats met to discuss what will become the non-aggression and trade agreement known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This pact included a secret protocol establishing spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Nearly all of the Baltic region went to Russia, and that included Finland. Finland could only watch as the Russians occupied their share of the East European states one by one. Then, on October 5th, it was their turn. The Finns were invited to talks where the Russians laid out their demands. Russia's primary interest in Finland was not of total conquest, but of a border adjustment to move Finland away from the city of Petrograd, which the Russians believed to be dangerously exposed to Finland. This border adjustment involved the transfer of a significant part of the Karelian Isthmus to Russia, moving the border to within 20 miles of the major Finnish city of Viipuri. The Soviets also demanded the dismantling of all fortifications on the Isthmus and the handover of some and leasing of other islands in the Baltic. In compensation, the Finns would be given 5,500 square kilometers in East Karelia. This was not the first time the Russians had asked for something similar to this. They had made less forceful demands for a similar border adjustment back in April of 1938. There were even those in the Finnish government who believed they should have given in to those relatively modest Soviet demands to avoid a future war. Mannerheim was amongst them. But they didn't get their way, as at the time the Finns were able to play the Germans and Russians off of each other. But now, with the Russian Molotov Pact precluding German intervention, the Finns were vulnerable. The Finnish government believed that this was only the beginning of Soviet demands, so to give in and destroy their fortifications now would leave them unable to resist future demands. Negotiations dragged out until November 3rd, when the Russians got so frustrated by Finnish recalcitrance that their chief negotiator, Molotov, whose name makes up half of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, snapped. Since we civilians don't seem to be making any progress, perhaps it's the soldiers' turn to speak. It was only after the negotiations fell apart that the Finnish government thought to ask Mannerheim what their prospects were in case of a war. He told them the same thing he told them back in 1938, that the Russians were not bluffing, that their demands were serious, and that the Red Army was a formidable enemy. Finland's military, he explained, was critically deficient in weapons and ammo, while its air force was tiny and obsolete. He said that Finland's only real military asset was delusionally high morale among the soldiers. The politicians thought that Mannerheim was just afraid of the Russian army, most unbecoming of a proper Finn. He was technically Swedish after all, so they ignored him. When the war came, Mannerheim would be proven right about every point except for one. On November 26th, 7 artillery shells landed 800 meters inside of Soviet territory. The Soviet government sent a furious note accusing the Finns of having fired them, holding them responsible for the supposed deaths of 4 and wounding of 9 Russian troops. This accusation was absurd for many reasons, not least of which being that every Finnish gun had been ordered deep inside of Finland so it would be impossible to fire into Soviet territory. It is almost certain that the Soviets fired those shots themselves. Helsinki protested its innocence, citing the attack's very impossibility as proof. But the Soviets gave them no response. Instead, the Kremlin issued a public note stating that their forces were under attack across the Soviet-Finnish border, that this was the exclusive fault of the Finnish government, that normal relations were to be ended, and that Finnish representatives were to be recalled. In essence, a declaration of war. A few hours later, Helsinki was bombed. Finland was now at war. In the days leading up to the war, Mannerheim declared that the Finnish army was in such a poor state that he could no longer accept responsibility for the defense of Finland. He appealed desperately to his government to reopen negotiations, and after that failed, tried to resign on November 27th. But instead, right after the bombs fell on the capital, he was made commander-in-chief. Mannerheim's assessment of the Finnish army proved to be totally accurate. It didn't have so much as a single tank, lacked anti-air and anti-air weapons, and was critically low on all types of ammunition. And, while morale was high, the troops were terrified of Soviet tanks. However, both sides massively overestimated the capabilities of the Red Army. While it is true that the Russians enjoyed a marked advantage in manpower and material, including armor, artillery, and ammunition, it suffered from fundamental problems. Finland was not conducive to large army formations, and the quality of Russian troops was mixed. Their tactics and leadership were even worse. Russian commanders were trapped in a highly regimented command structure, restricting their tactics to very little other than mass frontal assaults. The Russian forces also made no proper preparations for winter fighting, failing to so much as paint their vehicles white. At the very least, the Soviets attacked during a favorable season, and they had built up infrastructure along the Finnish border to relieve some of the logistical challenges. However, the good weather would only last them a few weeks. Failure to defeat the Finns quickly would allow the subarctic winter to set in, putting a halt to military operations. All of this is before considering the massive advantages the terrain gave to Finland. They were far more comfortable in the subarctic conditions than the Russians, and knew the local terrain. The Finns had even mapped out and pre-ranged every likely target of artillery in advance. So while Finland's limited ammo made it impossible to do things like saturation bombardments, they were at least able to make their limited ammunition count. The bulk of the fighting would take place on the Karelian Isthmus, guarded by the Mannerheim Line, Finland's most powerful defensive construction, though it was nothing like France's Maginot Line to which it is often compared. The Mannerheim Line was mostly a network of trenches punctuated by concrete bunkers. While not particularly impressive in itself, when combined with the difficult terrain, subarctic conditions, and a garrison of determined troops, it was a formidable obstacle. In preparation for the invasion, civilians were removed from the approaches, and their housing and infrastructure were destroyed and replaced by barbed wire and tank traps. Incredibly, it was discovered after the war that Soviet intelligence had accurate maps of Finland's defenses the whole time, but no one actually bothered getting it to the troops. Going into the war, there was a joke being told among the Finnish troops. They are so many, and our country is so small. Where will we find the room to bury all of them? As bombs fell on Helsinki and other major cities across Finland, the Finnish government changed hands from anti-Soviet hardliners to more conciliatory leadership whose #1 priority was opening negotiations with the Russians. They also did everything they could to secure foreign support for the war effort. The main Soviet attack on the Karelian Isthmus was carried out by over 100,000 men and 1,000 tanks. Finnish operational security was quickly breached, as the Russians were able to tap into their communications and sow confusion with false messages. But the Russian columns advanced with absurd caution. Even light small arms fire would be enough to halt an advance for hours. When the Soviets finally found the actual Finnish positions, they failed to coordinate their artillery, airstrikes, armor, and human waves. The only Soviet assets proving to be effective were their tanks, whose presence alone was enough to rout Finnish troops. But it didn't take long for the Finns to get over their fear, and to develop weapons and tactics to handle them. The primary method the Finns used to fight tanks was to simply ignore them and focus fire on their infantry support. When the infantry was wiped out, the tanks would either have to retreat or face destruction at the hands of rushing Finns armed with anything from Molotov cocktails to logs and crowbars intended for jamming in the tank's wheels. When the Soviets finally reached the Mannerheim line, they began to suffer truly atrocious casualties. The fiercest fighting was on the Finnish left, abutting Lake Ladoga. Here, the worst of bad tactics, improper equipment, and well-prepared Finnish defenses caused the Russians to suffer extreme casualties for hardly any gain. It was not uncommon for single Russian attacks to result in over 1,000 deaths, the loss of dozens of tanks, and no progress. Some Finnish machine gunners even had to be removed from the front due to the psychological stress of killing so many people so easily. By late December, much of the Russian armor had been destroyed and their supplies consumed, causing the offensive to falter. This seemingly miraculous curbing of the Red Army sent Finnish commanders, including Mannerheim, into a state of euphoria, one so delusional that it convinced them to launch a counteroffensive. The plan was to attack and surround a Soviet salient to destroy the 3 divisions inside. Among the many problems with this plan was that, as battered as the Russians were, the Finnish army was in an even worse position. Food was unreliable for everyone, and many units lacked water. They couldn't eat the snow either because it had been contaminated from Russian shelling. All of the men were exhausted from the fighting, and without many reserves, those same spent troops would have to be the ones to carry out the offensive. Moreover, the only reason why the Finns were able to perform so well is that their entire military was trained and preparing for this style of defensive warfare and no other. The army was downright amateurish when it came to the kinds of conventional offensives their leadership was asking of them. And, just as the Finns were weak on the offensive, the Russians were tenacious defenders. To cap it all off, right before the offensive, a blizzard hit the area. Needless to say, on December 23rd, after a paltry artillery barrage, the advance of exhausted Finnish troops was quickly halted, and the attack had to be called off. But not before the Finns needlessly suffered 1,300 combat casualties and 200 cases of frostbite. The Mannerheim line kept the Karelian Isthmus safe, but the rest of Karelia was not nearly as well fortified. Why would it be? It was naturally fortified by dense forests and lacked the infrastructure needed to support large army formations. Who would attack there? While the Finns had anticipated some Soviet offensives in the area, they were taken aback by their scale and ferocity. It turned out that the Soviet plan was to overwhelm Finland with massive attacks from every possible direction, the most important of which was the one north of Lake Ladoga. If successful, the thrust would bypass the Mannerheim line and cut it off from supply. The attack proved so dangerous that 1/3 of Finland's reserves were sent just to reinforce the one area. The Russians came close to breakthrough at several points, with one not even being stopped by the Finns, but by the hunger of the Russian troops. You see, after a Russian assault broke through the Finnish defenses, they passed through an abandoned Finnish field kitchen. The starving Russians stopped their advance to sate their hunger on the fresh-cooked food. This gave the cooks and other backline troops the time they needed to organize a counterattack, successfully plugging the gap. Reportedly, the Old Finnish war cry of Hakka Pele, dating all the way back to the 30 Years' War, could be heard during some of the close-range fighting that ensued. Finnish success on the Mannerheim line was a tremendous accomplishment, but the parts of the Winter War that really captured the imagination all happened far to the north of it. That's where truly exotic formations like ski troopers, reindeer-pulled logistics sleds, and elite woodsman snipers like Simo Heiha, the White Death, were most prevalent. And, of course, where the famous Motti encirclements took place. The Finnish word Motti refers to a pile of logs or timber held in place by stakes so it can be chopped or sawn into firewood. It's a great analogy for an enemy column cut up into multiple smaller encirclements before liquidation. But, like another famous term from the era, blitzkrieg, the name is an anachronism. The Finns had no specific doctrine for creating Mottis. Those that did form were often an accident, and frequently did the Finns more harm than good. The goal of the Finnish defenses was to break Soviet formations so they would flee back across the border. All that the Mottis did was trap the Russians inside of Finland. Each Motti would either have to be patrolled, taking precious troops away from the front, or be liquidated through costly attacks that the Finns could not afford. Some Mottis even survived until the end of the war, thanks to aerial resupply and to the remarkable ability of Russian troops to fight on the most minimal rations. However, some of the Mottis would turn out well for the Finns, especially around Sumo Salmi, where Motti tactics were used to destroy the Soviet 44th and 163rd Rifle Divisions. The far north of Finland, like every other front, saw massive commitments of Soviet troops. But here, the infrastructure actually was too poor to support the invaders. The most significant Soviet victory was the capture of Petsamo, Finland's only port into the Arctic, and a nearby high-grade nickel mine. But the Finns expected to lose them anyway, so only put up token resistance before retreating, scorching the earth behind them. The Russians could have been happy with this victory, but instead, they chose to push deeper into Finland. By December, this near-polar region entered a state of continuous darkness. The Finns felt right at home in this extreme environment, harassing the Soviets with snipers, many of whom were locals with a lifetime of hunting experience in the area. The further the Russians advanced, the worse things got for them. By January, with temperatures as low as -35 degrees Celsius, Russian offensive operations in the far north were halted, and the soldiers hunkered down in whatever shelters they could find. The Finns did not totally restrict themselves to defensive operations for the Winter War. Elite ski units were sent across the border to perform operations that remain classified to this day, though their most likely objective was to sabotage the Murmansk Railroad. Now, Finland was not alone in its war against the Soviets. Nations across the world sent large amounts of material and volunteer aid to Finland. The Soviet invasion of Finland sparked immediate condemnation from the international community and inspired mass foreign support for Finland. Even Germany, in spite of their non-aggression pact, tried to help the Finns until their efforts were discovered. Europe's other great right-wing dictatorship, however, was under no such restrictions. The Italian state and people threw themselves into the Finnish camp. At one point, the Finnish ambassador was paraded through the streets on the shoulders of black shirts as the Russian embassy was pelted with rocks. This was alongside considerable material aid, including 17 Fiat bombers and 150 volunteers. Assistance from Italy and other nations would soon grow the once small and obsolete Finnish Air Force into a modern armada of over 200 aircraft. Other nations sending aid included the United States, Hungary, Belgium, France, and South Africa. But Finland's most effective supporters were its fellow Nordic nations, Denmark, Norway, and especially Sweden. Of Finland's 11,500 foreign volunteers, 8,000 came from Sweden. While this aid was impressive, a lot of it had less of an impact than you would expect. Most of it was coming from distant countries, and the Finnish merchant fleet was too small to efficiently transport all of it, meaning most would only arrive after the war had ended. However, the Winter War wasn't just a moral issue. To some nations, it presented a geopolitical opportunity. World War II was still ongoing, so the Allies, at this point mostly just Britain and France, presented Finland with a unique offer. Their German enemy was highly reliant on raw materials imported from Sweden. The Allies wanted to use the Finns as an excuse to land troops in Scandinavia and stop those shipments. The Finns were supposed to do this by issuing a public call for help against the Soviet invasion, the idea being that this would convince the pro-Finnish Norwegians and Swedes to allow Allied troops through their territory to defend their darling Finland. There were only two problems. The first is that as sympathetic as Norway and Sweden were to Finland, there was no way they were going to sacrifice their neutrality for it. And second, no part of the Allied plan actually involved helping Finland. As a sweetener, the Finns were offered a few brigades, but that was nothing compared to the whole divisions earmarked for the rest of the region. Because of the plan's absurdity, the Finns would only consider it if they were truly desperate, and given their sterling performance so far, how likely was it really to come to that? Back in the Soviet Union, the Russians were getting serious. Before the war began, many military leaders criticized the invasion plan, but were ignored. Now that they were proven right, those critics were put in charge of the war effort and allowed to run it their way. The human wave tactics of the past would be relegated to a secondary role, behind a new focus: tank spearheads with infantry reserves positioned to rush into the breaches. Coordination between all branches was improved, and massive amounts of artillery and even railroad guns were brought in to blast the Finnish defenses into dust. In the first 24 hours of the new offensive, over 300,000 shells were fired at the Mannerheim line. The shelling continued for days, with increasing intensity, destroying Finnish fortifications and stressing the garrisons to their limit. In spite of the damage it had suffered, the Mannerheim line was still formidable, but the Russians were just as willing as ever to spend ammunition and lives to break through it. The new Russian offensives were far more effective, inflicting considerable casualties on the Finns and creating many near breakthroughs. The pressure became so intense that on February 15th, the Finnish army fell back to their second line of defenses. This retreat made clear that the Finns were losing the war. The government decided it was time to make peace with the Russians. If that failed, they would beg the Swedes to join the war. And only if those attempts both failed, they would resort to the Allies' whack job plan. The Finns put out feelers to the Swedes to see how likely they would be to intervene, but the Swedes shot the idea down immediately. They wanted the Finns to make peace now while they were still likely to keep their independence. That way, Finland would remain as a buffer between themselves and Russia. The Soviets laid out their preliminary demands to Finland on February 25th. When the Allies found out about this on the 29th, they responded with hysteria. The French government had staked all of its legitimacy on the Finland scheme, so in desperation offered to send 50,000 troops and 100 bombers to Finland by the end of March if the Finns issued the call for help. But it was obvious to everyone that the French couldn't have delivered on this if they tried. The British, meanwhile, and only slightly less delusionally, considered landing troops in Norway without permission in the hopes that the Norwegians would just let them in. The Russians presented their final terms on March 8th. They included the cession of the entire Karelian Isthmus, the Rybaki Peninsula, and much of the Sala district. The island of Hanko would be leased for 25 years to build a military base, and Finland would have to sign a mutual assistance pact with the Soviets. The Soviets said that their terms were non-negotiable, but the Finns tried anyway. First, they argued that a more lenient peace would allow Finland and Russia to enjoy better relations in the future. And when that failed, they asked the Russians to at least pay for the land like Peter the Great had back in 1721. At that, Molotov snapped. Then write a letter to Peter the Great. If he orders it, then we'll pay compensation. Between that and throwing their lot in with the Allies, the Finns chose to sign the treaty on the 13th. 15 minutes before the scheduled ceasefire, the Soviets fired one last massive artillery barrage at the Finnish army. And with that, the Winter War had ended with the miraculous survival of Finland. Almost 25,000 Finns died in the fighting, while over 40,000 were wounded. Nearly every Finn living in the ceded territory chose to relocate into the remains of their country, displacing 12% of the nation's population. The Russians suffered much worse casualties, up to 270,000 dead and 300,000 wounded, all for 25,000 square miles of territory. As one Russian general put it, "We've won just about enough ground to bury our dead." The new Finland that emerged from the Winter War was isolated and vulnerable. Its eastern border was practically indefensible, and the German conquests of Denmark and Norway put Finland into even deeper isolation than from before the war. In desperation, Finland and Sweden, the last two independent states in the region, considered forming an alliance or even political union with each other. But those plans were foiled by the Germans and Russians, who wanted to keep Scandinavia divided and more easily influenced. This left Germany as Finland's only viable security partner against Russia. Finno-German cooperation began in September of 1940, with a treaty allowing German troops to pass through Finnish territory to reach parts of occupied Norway. In spite of Soviet protests, the relationship blossomed from there. The Germans would eventually key the Finns in to their plans to invade Russia, and promised to return lost territory or even to expand Finland if they participated. It was a tempting offer. If the Germans defeated the Soviet Union, which seemed likely, the Finns would have been foolish not to secure a share of the spoils. But the cost of defeat in an offensive war would be catastrophic. So, while the Finns agreed to participate, they did their best to position themselves as co-belligerents, and not as allies, and also made it their policy to never justify Russian security concerns by not attacking Leningrad from the north. All of this left Finland's war goals kind of vague. Their stated war aims were to recover lost territory from the Winter War, but there was also a clear interest in taking more than that, which was itself conditioned on the Germans doing all of the hard work first. This confused tangle of interests, which were never clearly communicated to the Germans, would cause serious problems for the coming war effort. Because, as the Germans were preparing to fight a total war of annihilation against the Soviets, the Finns were only preparing to fight a limited war for ambiguous objectives. Anti-Soviet sentiments in Finland were high, so the coming conflict would enjoy both popular and political support. The Finns began their mobilization in June, and would eventually raise a remarkable 630,000 soldiers from its population of 4 million people. There was little proper planning between Finnish and German forces in the lead-up to the invasion. The main focus of discussion was on placing German troops on an unimportant part of the Finnish front to free Finnish troops for more important missions, and so the Germans could attack strategic targets like the Murmansk Railroad and the city of Murmansk itself. When the German invasion began on June 22nd, the Finns declared neutrality. But the farce was revealed the next day when the Luftwaffe began operating from Finnish air bases. On the 25th, the Soviets launched counter-raids into Finland, prompting the Finns to declare what they claimed to be a defensive war. The Finnish army of 1941 was a far superior force to that of the Winter War back in '39. The new army was larger, more experienced, and thanks to the Germans, much better equipped. Large Soviet formations had been removed from the Finnish front to help cope with the main German invasion, so by the time the Finns began their offensive, they enjoyed local superiority of up to 4-1. The Finns had little difficulty advancing up to their lost territory and beyond. By the end of 1941, the Finns had achieved their objectives, but the Germans had not. They failed to take Murmansk, or cut the railroad leading to it. This would become a major problem, because that was one of the main inlets for Allied Lend-Lease. The broader German army didn't achieve its objectives either. Major cities like Leningrad, Stalingrad, and the capital in Moscow remained in Soviet hands. The Finns, content with their gains and weakened by their losses from the offensives, were unwilling to do much to help the Germans fix any of this. The Finns also became the target of diplomatic pressures from their former partners in Great Britain and the United States. The Finnish relationship with the Germans began to sour in July, when the Germans forced the Finns to break diplomatic relations with the United Kingdom. This prompted the British to bomb Pechanga and join the Americans in intensifying their diplomatic pressures. The Americans even published a Russian peace offer to Finland to sow distrust between the Finns and the Germans. The scheme worked, causing the Germans to force the Finns into signing the Anti-Comintern Pact, which was only possible because Germany was providing Finland with much of its food. The relations with the Allies fully broke down at the end of November, when the British sent an ultimatum to Finland demanding it cease military operations against the Soviet Union. Though interestingly, there was no demand for a withdrawal from Russia. Regardless, when the deadline passed without an answer, the British declared war on Finland. In August, the Germans tried again to take Leningrad, and asked the Finns to help by attacking from the north. In keeping with their policy of not justifying Russia's security concerns, the Finns refused. But, in keeping with their second policy of committing more to the war if the Germans seemed likely to win it, told the Germans that they would reconsider if they made good progress. Finnish complacency allowed the Soviets to relocate even more troops from the Finnish front. So now, with the Soviet forces opposite Finland weaker than ever before, the Germans tried again to convince the Finns to take advantage and attack Leningrad, an operation which, by this point, would have certainly succeeded. But the Finns remained recalcitrant. So in 1942, the Germans planned Operation Nordlicht, Northern Lights, to finally capture Leningrad and convince the Finns to commit to the war. But the Soviets beat them to the punch with their own offensive around Leningrad in August, doing enough damage to the German army to make Nordlicht impossible. The period from 1943 to the summer of '44 was remarkably quiet for Finland. Germany, however, had a very different experience. In that time, they were completely pushed out of Africa, lost army groups south at Stalingrad, and suffered Allied landings in Italy and later France. The Finns noticed all of this and became convinced that they were on the losing side of the war. They started to look for an exit. First, and rather naively, the Finns just tried asking for Germany's permission to leave the war. Not only was that refused, but it prompted the Germans to demand a written assurance from Finland that they would not negotiate a separate peace. The Finns relented when their prime minister stated in a speech that Finland would fight to the end rather than submit to the Soviet Union. The text of that speech was sent to the Germans with an explanation that it represented Finland's official attitude. In spite of that supposed assurance, secret talks were held between the Allies, Finns, and Russians, but they went nowhere, as the Finns kept finding Russia's terms too harsh. This convinced the Soviets that they had to knock the Finns to their senses, and to do it before the Allies were in a position to further influence the peace terms. So on June 10, 1944, after a massive buildup of troops and equipment along the Finnish front, the Soviets launched their 1944 Finnish offensive. Due to the massive buildup of forces, the Soviets outnumbered the Finns several times over, both in terms of equipment and manpower. They gained significant ground, even on the first day, and by the 20th, they took Viipuri. This was such a shock that the Finns started taking the negotiations seriously. So as the army fell back to interior lines of defenses, the Finnish government simultaneously reached out to Germany for military assistance and to the Soviet Union for peace. Even though the Germans were well aware of Finnish efforts to leave the war, they decided to commit huge resources to defending them anyway. This included air wings, military equipment, and whole army divisions. On June 23rd, the Soviets responded to Finnish peace offers with interest, but demanded, as a precondition, that the Finnish Prime Minister and President sign a document stating that they were ready to surrender. The Finns interpreted this as a demand for unconditional surrender, so refused. While that was going on, Mannerheim tried to reassure Germany. He sent a letter to Hitler thanking him for his aid, and stating that Finland was ready to pursue closer ties with Germany. While that was definitely a lie, the Germans took advantage by threatening to end all support unless the Finns signed a binding alliance. So with the Soviets demanding unconditional surrender on one side and the Germans demanding an alliance on the other, the Finns chose the Germans. But the Finnish people and parliament were both vehemently opposed to closer ties with Germany, making the formal alliance impossible. Instead, the Finnish president, Motti, publicly broadcasted a statement of Finland's commitment to Germany. But, as president, he could not truly speak for the government. To make that distinction clear, Parliament voted to protest the arrangement. Eventually, the Finns managed to beat back the Soviet attacks and stabilize their front. But far to the south, the German army was being annihilated in Poland. The Finns were running out of time to make peace. So moving quickly, Motti resigned on July 31st, freeing Finland from what little commitment it still had to Germany, and Parliament passed a law unanimously making Mannerheim president without election. It was time to leave the war. The stabilizing of the Finnish front and catastrophes in the south forced Germany to relocate many of its Finnish forces back to the continent. With so many of their troops leaving Finland, Germany's only remaining leverage was their control over the country's food supply. But even that was gone when the Swedes agreed to feed Finland if it left the war. So in anticipation of likely fighting with the Germans, the Finns began to fortify positions vulnerable to German troops. On August 24, 1944, another one of Germany's unhappy partners, Romania, announced an armistice with the Soviets. The Finns sued for peace on August 25th. The Soviet terms, which were approved by the Allies, arrived on the 29th. To begin, Finland had to immediately make a public announcement that they were ending their relations with Germany. And second, they had to demand a withdrawal of all German troops from Finland by September 15th. Any German troops still in the country would have to be disarmed and handed over to the Soviets as prisoners. Those were only the preliminary peace terms, though. The rest of the treaty remained a mystery. But, in spite of that, Parliament voted to accept the terms. After a ceasefire was established, which the Soviets violated for at least 24 hours, the final peace terms were laid out. They included a return to the 1940 borders, plus the surrender of the Pechanga region, taking away Finland's only access to the Arctic Sea. A 50-year lease on the Porkala Peninsula, putting the Soviets in artillery range of Helsinki, and war reparations which could be paid in kind with raw materials. The Finns were also given 10 weeks to reduce their armed forces to peacetime levels, and the Soviets would have the right to use Finnish ports, airfields, and merchant shipping until the end of their war with Germany. On September 19th, the Finns agreed to all terms. Even after the treaty was signed, Soviet troops continued to cross into Finland wherever they found German forces to attack and no Finnish forces to stop them. The Germans, meanwhile, desperately tried to maintain good relations with Finland to protect their forces as they fled the country. But much of that broke down when the Germans tried and failed to invade the strategic Finnish island of Sirsauri. Not only were the Germans defeated by the Finns, but also the Soviet Air Force who assisted them. In Finland proper, Finnish and German forces had an informal agreement to limit their fighting during the withdrawal, but it broke down as the pursuit dragged on, and especially after the deadline for evacuation passed. On October 3rd, relations broke down completely, with the Germans announcing that they would fight the Finns without restraint. Nonetheless, the German withdrawal into Norway was completed on April 27th, concluding the second time in Finnish history that once Allied German troops had to be forcibly ejected from the country. Which isn't a lot, but it is strange that it happened twice. That day, April 27th, would be Finnish Veterans Day ever since. And with that, Finland's part in the Second World War, also known as the Continuation War, was over. The conflict saw Finland suffer 52,000 killed, 7,300 missing, and 148,000 wounded. This included Finland's fighting with the Germans towards the end, which saw 800 dead and 4,000 wounded. According to Finland, the Soviet casualties on the Finnish front were 270,000 killed and 550,000 wounded. Finland's continued existence as an independent state is a testament to the will and tenacity of its people. As a nation of only a few million, she twice fought and survived war with Russia, a nation many times her size, population, and wealth. The man who led them through all of this, Mannerheim, explains the significance of this in his speech to the Finnish army at the end of the Winter War. "Soldiers, I have fought on many battlefields, but never have I seen your like as warriors. After 16 weeks of bloody combat, with no rest by day or night, our army stands unconquered before an enemy whose strength has grown in spite of terrible losses. Our fate is hard, now that we are compelled to surrender to an alien race, land which for centuries we have cultivated with our labor and sweat. Yet we must put our shoulder to the wheel, in order that we may prepare, on the soil left to us, a home for those rendered homeless, and a better life for all. And, as before, we must be ready to defend our diminished homeland with the same resolution and with the same fire with which we defended our undivided homeland. We are proudly conscious of our historic duty, which we shall continue to fulfill, the defense of Western civilization, which has been our heritage for centuries. But we also know that we have paid, to the last penny, any debt we may have owed to the West. That an army so inferior in numbers and equipment should have inflicted such serious defeats on an overwhelmingly powerful enemy, and, while retreating, have over and over again repelled his attacks, is a thing for which it is hard to find a parallel in the history of war. But it is equally admirable that the Finnish people, face to face with an apparently hopeless situation, were able to resist giving into despair, and instead to grow in devotion and greatness. Such a nation has earned the right to live. And that was Finland's Civil War, Winter War, and the Continuation War. Thanks again to this video's sponsor, Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. Scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description and use our promo code HELLOAPR to get 2,000 gold and 50 Blackstone. Like, comment, and subscribe for more. I'll see you in the next one. Special thanks to all our Patreon supporters, including our Into Space supporters, Commissar Bragg, Duke Nelson, Feline Man, G.S. Rogers, Josiah, Karazin, Lord Inquisitor Zarius Drakart, Micro, Pater, Swiss Cheesus, the Raven Union, the Union of X, and Petri von Steiff.